So there's a single tip for interviewing that's immensely important that no one talks about. You need to physically record yourself while you're doing questions and actively watch back the recording to fix your own mistakes. On top of that, you need to be as closely simulating the actual environment of an interview as possible while doing your questions. Let me explain why. So studying for these software engineering interviews is all about being efficient with your time, because you don't want to end up like me and end up spending like a year studying these questions. So the most efficient way is to tackle the emotional and mental pressure of these interviews first. I've been in the industry for some time now, and I've had to interview a good amount of people across all the companies I've worked at. But what separates someone that the team would recommend versus someone that they wouldn't? A lot of people like to say it's the communication skills, but what does that really mean? Well, I can give an example. At a previous company, we actually hired someone specifically because of their communication skills, even though they didn't pass the technical assessment. And you might say, how? That goes against everything I've heard and learned. Well, to start, she was very honest about everything that she didn't know. It might shock you, but there's definitely a lot of people out there who will try to mislead you into thinking that they actually know something that they don't. She's also very methodical in how she approached the question. She always kept her attitude up, and when she didn't know something, she always said that she would be happy to research more into it. You see, there's two kinds of mindset. There's this famous experiment conducted where there were two groups of kids. Both were given puzzles that were way too hard for their age. One group, the fixed mindset group, were the ones who couldn't solve the puzzle and took it as a hit on their intelligence. And the other group, the growth mindset one, took it as a really good challenge and motivation to learn more so that they could solve questions like this in the future. I'll link to an article more about it. But if you can exhibit a growth mindset during an interview, you're gonna put yourself in a really good spot. The takeaways here are: be a genuine person, and if you don't know something, just say you don't know. If you're not sure, take your best guess, but don't try to lie about anything. And if you're stuck on a question that seems way too hard, don't be afraid to break it down methodically and ask your interviewer for any hints. They'll give you what they can. So how do we develop these communication skills? Well, let's take, for example, a non-coding activity. Let's take football, for example. If you want to get better at throwing the football, there's only two ways. You can hire someone to watch you and fix your mechanics based off of what they see, or you can record yourself and watch back the recording and fix any mistakes that you see. So we can try to apply the same concept to software interviews. Let me give you a personal example of when I realized this was important. I never once recorded myself interviewing. I just assumed that I was communicating well because it all sounded like it made sense in my head. And then years ago, I was sitting on the other side of the interview table, and I realized I couldn't really understand the thought process of the interviewee, probably mostly because of the pressure of the interview. It seemed like the interviewee had pretty much the entire question correct. His code was literally one line off from being correct, but he kept going completely silent, so his code kept getting more and more complicated to the point where it was really difficult to understand. So remember that the interviewers need to understand your code during the interview as well, and they're usually probably not like LeetCode grandmasters or anything. Probably. So if you over-engineer and overcomplicate a solution, you're gonna put them into sleep mode, and it's gonna be really hard to bounce back after that. And after that, I realized for my own interview, I should probably be recording myself to see if my communication makes any sense at all. And then after doing just like a random LeetCode hard question and recording myself the whole way and watching it back, I realized my communication was much worse than I thought. So there's three major mistakes that I made. Number one, I had a tendency to randomly ramble on and kind of overcomplicate the problem without first solving the basics. The second is that I would make assumptions in my head that didn't always make sense when I was communicating them. And the third was that I talked way too fast and I kind of just seemed like way too nervous. If your interviewer thinks you have no idea what you're doing, it's likely that they're going to stop paying attention, and that's going to be a really tough spot to get a higher mark for. So what did I do to try to correct my mistakes? The first one was that every time I would get stuck on a problem, I would take a second to gather my thoughts and specifically try to articulate what exactly I was stuck on and if I was trying to over-engineer the problem. And then if I already had a slower solution that would work, I would implement that first before trying to optimize it. I would also actively try to speak slower when explaining my thought process. When I was talking way too fast, I could barely understand myself. And if I can't understand myself, no one else is going to understand me either. So the other alternative or complement to recording yourself is to do mock interviews with a friend. Okay, this sounds really nerdy, and if I had gotten this advice in college, I would have kind of just like rolled my eyes. But again, you don't want to be studying these questions for years. So interviewing with a friend actually gives you a lot of benefits that you wouldn't get from doing it alone, and that'll make you much more efficient. The first is that it'll allow them to give you actual, real, raw feedback about how you're doing and your progress. The second is that they'll be able to simulate an actual interview environment and kind of guide you towards the correct solution that you couldn't really do by doing LeetCode by yourself, because in those cases, it's either you get the question or you look at the solution. And the third is that it simulates actual pressure, which is the whole point of interviews. And on the flip side, interviewing someone else will help you see their communication breakdowns to give them feedback, and you can also apply that to your own technique. I remember watching a video a while back with the perfect analogy. If you're a boxer and you train technique all day, every day for years, and you never jump in a ring, when you do for the first time with someone who's a seasoned boxer, you're gonna be absolutely destroyed, because nothing can really substitute the raw stress and emotion of actually being in the real spot. Same thing for interviews. Nothing can really replace the mental and emotional pressure of having a random person judge your intelligence based off coding questions. So the takeaways are, just try doing a lot of interviews, because each one will prepare you for the next and make you better. And be prepared to fail, but try to welcome it as like a stepping stone for your progress. Time yourself and record yourself and simulate an actual environment while you're studying. Get a friend to work with you and tell you when your communication does and doesn't make sense. Keep in mind here, everything I said was in general. There could totally be an interview where the interviewer doesn't care about anything except you getting the right answer. But if that happens, just remember that these interviews are kind of just terribly subjective sometimes. And it's not an assessment of your skills or intelligence if you can't get it that time. There's definitely other things too, like good eye contact and posture, that's kind of overlooked in the tech interview industry. It's definitely not as important, but it can give you a slight edge. So I would think about those too when doing interviews. And let me know in the comments if there's anything else that stresses you about interviews.